The first successful attack on the French was called the Siege of Namur in 1695. Prior to the Siege of Namur, the Spanish had actually been fighting alongside England because they felt threatened by France's trade dominance. However, after this battle, Spain realized that they had been fighting for the wrong side and soon decided to join forces with France to defend against the British and the Dutch. The next major war to break out occurred between 1701 and 1714, called the War of Spanish Succession. As a result of these wars, Spain lost the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, Sardinia, Gibraltar, while France lost parts of Belgium and parts of the southern Netherlands. The next major battles were to take place during the War of Austrian Succession between 1740 and 1748. As a result of these wars, Spain did manage to gain a few of its territories back in northern Italy, but France suffered terribly due to a British blockade of its trade ships. All of these wars of Spanish and Austrian succession led to what many historians consider to be the first truly world war, known as the 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1763. The reason why many people consider this the first global war was because when fighting broke out, it included many colonies such as the Americas and the colonies of the Far East. In America, these battles became known as the French and Indian War. As a result of these wars, France lost Canada, some of its Caribbean islands, some territory in the West Indies, some of its territory in India, and all of the land east of the Mississippi in America, while Spain lost the state of Florida and the city of Manila in the Philippines. However, the main result of these wars was that France and Spain lost their positions as the world's global superpowers, and the Grand Alliance, which had formed in 1689 between the Dutch, the British, and the Holy Roman Empire, became the new world's superpower. However, this wasn't enough for the bankers. They wanted a private central bank of France, but it would take a French Revolution to accomplish that. At the end of the 7 Years' War, a new trend came to Paris known as the coffeehouse culture. In these coffeehouses, men would meet and discuss ideas about how living under a monarchy was a repressive form of existence, and how a truly independent parliament, which supposedly represented the people, could replace the crown. These ideas became especially powerful once they started circulating around the French Freemasonic lodges. Here it should also be mentioned the importance of the creation of the Illuminati in 1776 leading up to the French Revolution. Of course, most mainstream historians try to underplay the influence that Weishaupt's Illuminati had among the powerful elite, and especially they will deny the connection between Weishaupt's Illuminati and the growing religious movement known as Frankism, but we will cover that subject more in further videos. The age of so-called Enlightenment, which took place in the 17th century England, had finally spread to Paris by the end of the 18th century. The bankers used their control of the media to convince the people that revolution was the only way to go, and this led to the storming of the Bastille in 1789. In the same way that King Charles of England was beheaded in 1649, King Louis XVI was beheaded in 1792. And in the same way that the private central bank of England was created in 1694, the private central bank of France was created in the year 1800. After the bankers had taken over France, their next step was the takeover of Italy. This took place in the year 1802, just 2 years after the creation of the Bank of France, and lasted until the year 1893, with the creation of the private central bank of Italy. In 1796, Napoleon had launched his Italian campaign, and in the year 1802, the first Italian Republic was created. Napoleon would be sitting as the president of this Italian Republic. This lasted until the year 1805, when Napoleon crowned himself as the Emperor of France, and the northern part of Italy became known as the Kingdom of Italy. This Kingdom of Italy lasted from 1805 until 1814, when Napoleon was defeated. But the important thing which happened during this time was that the talk of uniting all of Italy into one giant republic had spread throughout the country. It became an especially popular idea among the Masonic lodges of Italy, which were known as the Carbonari at the time. With the fall of Napoleon and the restoration of the Habsburg monarchy in 1814, Freemasonry was supposedly banned. But rather than just disappearing, they simply went underground and kept on meeting in secret. By the year 1820, these Carbonari Freemasons had gathered together an army powerful enough to cause a riot against King Ferdinand I of Naples. King Ferdinand agreed to temporarily adopt a constitution which recognized a parliament. A second uprising occurred in 1821 against King Charles Felix of Sardinia. However, Habsburg's troops came down to dispel the Carbonari Freemasons. Pope Pius VII issued an excommunication against these Carbonari and captured several of their key leaders, but the movement still went on. The final attempt of these Carbonari to march against the monarchy occurred in 1831 against Rome itself, but again the Habsburg's troops came down and suppressed the movement. The remaining Carbonari took up a new movement under the name of Young Italy, under the leadership of Freemason Giuseppe Mazzini. The Young Italians' first attempt to revolt against the monarchy took place in 1834 in Savory, but several of them were arrested. Between the years 1841, 1843, and 1845, several other insurrections occurred in Sicily, Abruzzi, Tuscany, Lombardy, Venetia, Romagna, and Bologna. But despite these failures of all these insurrections, the movement kept on growing in strength. Finally, in the year 1848, the liberals filled the streets of Rome and assassinated the Pope's Minister of Justice. The Pope himself was forced to flee Rome in disguise. This was the birth of the Roman Republic. While the Pope was in exile, he left a delegation led by an archbishop in order to bargain with the rebels. Napoleon III did not approve of the requests being made of the Pope, so he sent his own troops to disband the Roman Republic in the Siege of Rome, 1849. However, the Pope would not return to Rome until 1850 because he also did not agree with the French requests either. Even after the Pope's return, an uneasy situation existed between the Church and the Italian unification movement, which lasted for another 20 years. Finally, at the start of the Franco-Prussian War, the French troops who were loyal to the Pope were forced to leave Rome, and the Italian unification movement pulled together an army which captured Rome in 1870. With the capture of Rome and the unification of Italy, the Private Bank of Italy was created in 1893. After the bankers had taken over Italy, their next step was the Takeover of America. This began in 1907, just 14 years after the creation of the Bank of Italy. With the panic of 1907, the bankers used this as an excuse to create the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Of course, the history of how the bankers took over America is more complex because America had been struggling against the bankers ever since the beginning. But in simple terms, Andrew Jackson's vow to kill the bank was fulfilled in 1836, and America had been free from a private central bank for 77 years before the modern-day Fed was created. However, let us take a look at the longer version of the history of banking in America. The first private central bank existed between 1782 and 1785. It was called the Bank of North America. In 1787, when the U.S. Constitution was written, the authors made the mistake of allowing provisions for another private central bank to be set up, and in 1791 a new private central bank was created. It was called the First Bank of America. In 1811, this central bank lost its charter, and the reluctance of Congress to renew its charter led America into the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, America got another private central bank called the Second Bank of America, established in 1816. In 1832, Congress had voted to renew the charter for this central bank, but Andrew Jackson vetoed this vote. There was an assassination attempt on Andrew Jackson's life in 1835, but fortunately, both of the assassins' guns misfired. In 1841, President John Tyler also vetoed a bill by Congress to renew the bank. For this, the Congress attempted to impeach him. In 1861, the bankers attempted to assassinate Abraham Lincoln before he could even step into office. However, Lincoln survived this attack, and when he got into office, he began printing greenbacks in order to stabilize the economy. In 1865, however, Lincoln was assassinated, and the bankers who controlled Congress began retracting his greenbacks. In 1881, President James A. Garfield was also assassinated because he was attempting to clean up some of the corruption which existed in Congress. In 1901, President McKinley was also assassinated for his attempts to clean up the corruption in Congress. And finally, with the bankers causing the panic of 1907, this led to the passing of the Federal Reserve Act. And in 1913 was the creation of the fourth and final private central bank of America. After the bankers had taken over America, their next step was the takeover of Russia. This took place in the year 1917, just 4 years after the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank of America. With the launching of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Bank of Russia was handed over to the Bolsheviks. In the year 1917, the bankers were able to accomplish both goals of launching the Bolshevik Revolution and getting their own private central bank. However, this was by no means the first time that Russia encountered problems with these bankers. Back in 1863, Tsar Alexander II had to suppress some separatist movements funded by the bankers. One of the reasons why the bankers hated Tsar Alexander II so much was because he was a close friend of Abraham Lincoln. In the same way that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves of America in 1863, Tsar Alexander II had done the same thing 2 years earlier when he freed the serfs of Russia in 1861. Also in the year 1863, the Tsar had sent several of his battleships to New York and San Francisco in order to help protect Lincoln in case of a French or a British attack. However, his opposition to the bankers eventually led up to his assassination in 1881. The next Tsar, Alexander III, even had to delay his own coronation for 2 years after his father's death for fear of the revolutionary forces which were still at work. Finally, the last Tsar, Nicholas II, had to deal with a whole variety of banker-created problems during his reign. One of them was called the Kishinev Pogrom of 1903. This was when Zionist forces inspired anti-Jewish riots in order to convince more of the Jewish people to leave Russia and migrate to Palestine. The second event was called the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, in which the bankers convinced the Japanese to invade Russia. Another failed attempt to overthrow the Tsar was the Russian Revolution of 1905, organized by the banker puppet Trotsky. And finally, in 1914, Russia got dragged into World War I due to the Battle of Tannenberg, when German forces attacked their troops in Prussia. With Russia having been dragged into World War I, the bankers started a major media propaganda campaign in order to rile the Russian people up to overthrow the Tsar. This culminated in the February Revolution of 1917, where the Tsar was forced to abdicate his throne. The vacuum left behind after the Tsar abdicated was the perfect environment for the bankers to insert their Bolshevik pawns, and on November 7th they launched their Bolshevik Revolution and immediately took control of the State Bank of Russia. But forcing the Tsar to abdicate and taking over his bank wasn't enough for them. They wanted him dead as well, and he and his whole family were executed on July 16th, 1918. The temporary central bank, which had been set up by the Bolsheviks in 1917, was eventually replaced by the main central bank of the Soviet Union in 1922, once the Bolsheviks had established their full control over Russia. After the bankers had taken over Russia, their next step was the takeover of Germany. This took place in the year 1918, just 1 year after the launching of the Bolshevik Revolution. In the year 1918, the bankers launched the Weimar Republic and the handing over of the Bank of Germany to the Weimar Republic. Just after the end of World War I, the German citizens had been riled up against the monarchy to launch a revolution of their own. Immediately after the creation of the Weimar Republic, the private central bankers took control of the German Deutsche Bank. But this was by no means the beginning of the problems which Germany had faced with these bankers. The history of German kings and emperors of the Holy Roman Empire in dealing with these bankers dates back to over 900 years before that. One of the first Holy Roman emperors to start borrowing money from the moneylenders in order to fund his wars was Emperor Henry II back in 1017. For the next 900 years, there is a long history of emperors and kings who either opposed the bankers or cooperated with them. Such a topic, however, would be the subject of another video. The last Holy Roman Emperor, of course, was Emperor Wilhelm II, who was forced to abdicate his throne on November 9th, 1918. And the bankers who had inspired the creation of the Weimar Republic in his wake immediately grabbed the control of the German Deutsche Bank and made it their own. After the bankers had taken over Germany, their last and final step for global domination was the takeover of Spain. This took place between the years 1931 and 1939. With the successful completion of the Spanish Civil War, the Bank of Spain was handed over to the so-called nationalists. In the year 1931, the bankers who controlled the media of Spain had stirred up the Spanish people to launch their own revolution against the king. But this was by no means the beginning of Spain's problems which they had faced with these bankers. One of the first Spanish kings to borrow money from the moneylenders was King Alfonso VI, way back in 1085. And for the next 846 years, there was a long history of Spanish kings who either opposed the bankers or cooperated with them. This, of course, however, would be the subject of another video. Finally, in the year 1931, King Alfonso XIII was forced to abdicate his throne at the beginning of the Spanish Revolution. His vacancy left Spain in a state of disarray which lasted for nearly 5 years. This state of disarray eventually led to the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939. Many historians in fact refer to this Spanish Civil War as the dress rehearsal for World War II. The bankers who controlled Germany and Italy were funding the so-called nationalists, while the bankers who controlled the Soviet Union were funding the so-called Republicans. Finally, in 1939, at the end of the Spanish Civil War, the Central Bank of Spain was handed over to the private central bankers.